Thank you everyone for being with us this morning. Last week we started getting ready. We're talking about the end of, what is the end of the liturgical year, which where we live is generally recognized as Christmas, but there are other holidays, there are other celebrations around this time of the year, the solstice, Hanukkah, Christmas, solstice celebrations. And there's actually a tie in between them. There's a commonality that if we step back away from the particular customs of a particular religion or the ancient religions, we have to ask ourselves, what is this about light? What is it about light that is so appealing to the human spirit? What is it about this idea that at the solstice the light returns? At the solstice, the shortest day of the year. But at the solstice, the light returns. And somehow that speaks to the human soul, that speaks to the human spirit. There is something within us, that's already within us, that recognizes the magnificence of the moment, the symbolism of the moment. And we have a need to celebrate it. We have a need to contemplate it. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing here for the last few weeks. Till we come to next week, we're going to talk about Christmas, and we're going to talk about metaphysical Christmas. We're going to look at the Christmas narratives from the point of view of symbolism. What do they stand for, and what do they mean in each and every one of our lives? Right? So Emmett Fox tells us when we read Scripture, we have to consider that each character in the story is an aspect of human consciousness, is an aspect of us. We understand the Pharaoh and how the Pharaoh treated Moses because we can relate to that. There's a part of us that understands that. We can relate to Moses because there's a part of us that can understand it. So when we start to take these scriptures and we start to dive into a deeper meaning and how they apply to us, we can sometimes come away with something that we didn't have before. So that's where we're going next week. But we had to prepare for that. We have to get ready for this event, this light that enters the world, this light that enters through us and as us. So it's interesting, if you look in the book of Genesis, which is generally the first book in the Bible as we use here, God created the light. It was first act of creation, created the light. And it wasn't the light, the sunlight. It was enlightenment. It was consciousness. Excuse me. So this light that is returning, this light that is coming back to us after the long winter nights or in preparation for the winter, we can also kind of see it as an expansion of consciousness, a growing. So we want to expand our experience today of this idea of the perfect whole, the perfect whole. This thing we call God or the divine or love or spirit or whatever name we give to it, we know that it is more than that name, right? It is much more than a name. That name is at best a symbol, or as Campbell tells us, a metaphor. He tells us that the word God is the metaphor for that which exceeds every limitation of human consciousness. Every limitation of human consciousness. Human consciousness understands birth and life and death. But the divine consciousness knows nothing, for it just is. Was never born, will never die, just is. The isness, the suchness, the I amness. It is. Human consciousness understands that there are limitations to knowledge. There are things that we can't know. And yet the divine concept is one of all knowing. Human consciousness understands there are limitations to what we can or cannot do. We lack power and resources. And yet the divine is all power. Creates all resources out of itself. So we have to understand as we commit ourselves to a deeper awakening of our conscious awareness of the presence of the divine in us, as us, through us, around us, the mystical experience, the experience of the Christ, that what we're awakening to, we are awakening from, and it is the perfect whole. There can be no lack or limitation in the divine. There can be nothing for the divine to struggle with or against. There can be no imperfection. None. It is perfect. It is whole. It is complete. We recognize that whatever the divine knows, whatever it thinks about, it creates. It creates. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be," and there was. Let there be, and there was. Now we would apply that in our own lives and say it is done unto us according to our belief. But the divine belief is total. As Emma Curtis Hopkins tells us, there's no mixture of evil in the divine idea of good. But there is in the human idea of good. And this is why we get to experience good and evil. There is no mixture of weakness in the divine idea of strength. There's no idea of blemish. There is only perfection. So if we can at least acknowledge, even though we as human beings are incapable of truly understanding that intellectually, right? It goes against everything we have experienced. But if we can at least understand the concept that there is this perfection, there is this perfect whole, then we can start to embrace our spiritual journey a little bit better. We can understand it a little bit better. We can let go of distractions and side trips and things like that along the way, because we understand from whence we come and where we are going, the perfect whole. So in Buddhism, there is a parable in Buddhism that I think is very useful to us, and you can read it if you just search for it on the internet. You'll find it, and many different Buddhist teachers discuss it. But it is the idea of a monkey that awakens from a period of unconsciousness, and it is inside a locked house. It doesn't know how it got there. It just knows that it comes into consciousness and it starts to explore its surroundings. And it can't get out. But there are windows in the house. And the monkey can see out the windows. And the monkey can see out to the forest. And it knows that it belongs in that forest. It knows that it comes from that forest. And it struggles and it tries to get out. And these windows are the five senses, right? The five senses that we have. And after a while, the monkey gets so acclimated to its surroundings, it becomes used to being captive in this house. It pushes against the walls and occupies itself by struggle. It flits from window to window, and it is distracted from here to there to someplace else. It does all of these things, but eventually it becomes complacent. It becomes accustomed to its imprisonment. And it starts to believe that existence in the captivity of the home, that is the real existence. And yet there is a part of it that still remembers. There is a part of it that remembers that perfect whole, that existence out there in the forest. Vernon Howard, who was a Unity minister down in Atlanta, wrote an excellent book called Psychopictography. And he's talking in this book about the power of visual images to convey a message. He says that we remember, if we hear a story that has a compelling visual image, that we remember that image long after we have forgotten the rest of the details of the story. And he uses those, in this book, he uses those and gives us many examples to give us stories that we will remember, that remind us of some aspect of the truth, some aspect of the perfect whole, if you want to consider it that way. And he starts the book off with a story of a young boy who's about 5 years old, and he's somewhere in Europe, and he's out playing, and he's kind of wandered a little bit away from his house. Excuse me, I gotta get a drink of water. He's wandered away from his house, and this band of strangers comes by in a wagon, and they scoop him up and they carry him away. And they kind of put him to work. They make him like a servant for the family, and he has to work for this family that has kidnapped him. And they carry him as they wander. They wander all over Europe, traveling from town to town, doing all the things that they do. They carry this boy with them. And this goes on for many years. And finally, when the boy's about 17 years old, he gets his chance to escape from them. And he leaves them one night. Now, he doesn't know where his home is. But he does remember one thing that he remembers about that home. He remembers as a young boy the sound of the church bell in the little chapel. And in all of the different places that he has traveled over the years that these people have carried him all around Europe wandering, he's never heard another bell quite like it. So he decides that what he is going to do is he's just going to walk from town to town to town until he hears that bell again. And he does. And he goes to a town and he hears the bell, and that's not it. And he goes to another town, and he hears the bell, and that's not it. And this continues on until one day he's walking up a hill, and he can hear coming from the other side of the hill, he can hear this familiar sound. He hears this bell, and he believes that's it, that's the one. And his heart quickens, and he picks up his pace, and he runs up to the top of the hill, and he gazes down into the valley, and the memory comes back to him. That is his home. That's where he belongs. That's where he came from. There is that within each and every one of us that remembers. There is that within each and every one of us that knows that there is something that is calling us home, but we may not be certain how to get there. But there's a stirring within us. There's a stirring within us that tells us there's someplace else. There's a different reality. There's a different experience. And that is where we truly come from. That is where we truly return, like the monkey in the house. We have become accustomed to our bodies. We have become accustomed to the ways of the world. We have become accustomed to our senses. And we believe that they represent to us the total of reality. And they do not. They do not. I often, if you're in any of the discussion groups that we hold or the classes, we talk about, in Western science, we spend so much time observing what's out there. Can we weigh it? Can we measure it? Can we touch it? Can we analyze it with our intellect? But we don't stop to ask, what is it that we are looking with? What is it that we are looking with? See, it is the witness. It is the observer. It is what we are looking with that is the reality, that leads us to the reality, that gives us a glimpse of the reality. But we have become so conditioned to believe that our experience is the only experience, our experience is the right experience, and our experience is unique only to us. Only to us. So what has happened is we have come to believe in separation. Now, part of us may take a while to awaken to the idea or even warm up to the idea that there is a perfect whole from which all things come. We may not even recognize it as there, We may be agnostic about the whole thing and say, well, maybe it is or maybe it isn't, but we have no way of knowing. But I think something happens, something stirs within us that keeps calling us. It's like that boy who has to go listen to one more bell, has to listen and walk to one more town because there's something within him that knows. There's something within him that knows. And it keeps calling him home. So if you have the textbook, go to page, during the week, go to page 327 and start to read that section on the perfect whole where Dr. Holmes is talking about these things. So we have to kind of understand, as I said, how is it that we are here? And how is it that if we are part of this perfect whole, that we don't experience it and we don't necessarily know it? Excuse me. And this comes into the quote that I used in the opening treatment, and I wish I could remember it exactly, but it's, it was something to the effect that out of the oneness, the multitude is created to dance, and the Creator enjoys the dancing. The Creator enjoys the dancing. To think of this idea that we are here, we as human beings, we are here as a celebration of life, as a celebration of divine life, as individualized expressions of the divine who are capable of becoming aware of who and what we are and of the presence of the divine within us and around us. We have that capability. And as we do this, we develop our unique personality, an individualized personality. Doesn't mean that we're separate, apart, or different than everyone or everything else. It means we're unique. We're unique. We're a unique expression of the divine life. Osho asks us to consider the ocean and the wave. He says the wave is the ocean. The wave is the ocean in expression. The wave is the ocean expressing itself as a wave. You can't take the wave away from the ocean. It wouldn't be a wave anymore. It'd be a puddle. But consider the waves as being an expression of the ocean. Each one is unique. Each one moves in a slightly different pattern. They all come and they crash on the shore and they go back into the ocean. But they were always part of the ocean. They were never separated from the ocean. They were just the ocean expressing itself as a wave. And what Osho asks us to consider is that you and I are God waving at itself, as us, through us. Divine love is expressing itself through us. Right? The divine loves you by means of me, loves me by means of you. When we hug, it is the divine hugging the divine. It is Spirit dancing with us, dancing through us, dancing as us, celebrating its own life uniquely. So what has happened to us is we come into the world and we are born into the world, but we are not fully awakened to this idea. And it would be impossible for us to be so, because if we were fully awakened at the moment of birth, we would be more like an automaton, more like a robot, more like a computer that was programmed. We wouldn't have this opportunity to develop our uniqueness. So we have, in the Hindu teachings, they say, man has had ignorance heaped upon him. Ignorance heaped upon him. And then with a wink and a nod says, but who heaped the ignorance and why? Who heaped the ignorance and why? But it's the same concept. It's the same concept that we are not born fully aware. We are not born fully enlightened, if you will. But there are clues. There are clues everywhere. It's kind of like Sherlock Holmes going around gathering clues. That's what our life is. We are seeing these clues that there is something greater than we are. There is something bigger than we are. So Dr. Holmes asks us to consider evolution, the process of evolution. And I've mentioned Thomas Troward's explanation of it before as well. But if you consider physical evolution, what physical evolution has done is it has moved from the simple life of a single-celled animal in the ocean up to a creature such as us that is capable of self-awareness. Self-awareness. We are aware that we are a self. We can become aware of what we are thinking. We can observe our thoughts. We are self-conscious beings. So it would seem that the purpose of physical evolution is to create this individual capable of self-awareness. And then the question we have to ask is, aware of what? Aware of what? So like the monkey locked in the house being trapped by its senses, we can become aware. We can become aware of the fact that there is something beyond the material. We can become aware that there is something from which the material comes from. There is something that the material goes back into. Okay? Universes are born, universes die. Stars are born, stars will die. We are born, our bodies are born, and our bodies die. See, there's this ebb and this flow of life. There's this constant cycling of things coming and things going. But from where do they come? See? And where do they go? So we can become, through our ability of self-reflection, of self-awareness, of self-analysis, we can become aware of the fact that the physical is a limitation. It is perfect, it is beautiful for what it does here for us, but it is not the be-all nor the end-all. It comes from somewhere. It goes from somewhere. And then we can start to desire this spiritual awakening. This is the point where we begin to awaken to the fact that we are spiritual beings. And from that point on, what Dr. Holmes tells us, and Trower says the same thing, and from that point on, our further advancement, our further growth, our further maturation as spiritual beings requires our conscious cooperation. See, evolution didn't need us to cooperate to get us this far. You know, we didn't have anything to do with the single-celled animal becoming a multi-celled animal. We didn't have anything to do with animals developing legs and crawling on land or crawling into the sea and losing their legs. That all happened. That all happened by a divine plan, a divine design. But once we reach the point of awareness that we are spiritual beings and that it is done unto us according to our belief, that we can become not only aware of our thoughts, but we can choose which thoughts to engage. Then we start to become aware that we are choosing our experience in life. And we have to consider then, if our true purpose in life is to become aware of the fact that we are spiritual beings, and to grow every day more fully in that experience, then we can choose to do that. Now, here, there's a couple things I kind of want to touch on here, because what we're getting into is this awakening, this feeling within us, this knowing that there is more. This is the birth. This is the birth. This is the beginning of the spiritual awareness within us. So consider for a moment how appetite and desire works in our human life. Our bodies are regulated, our existence is regulated, if you will, by our appetites, by our desires for food, our desires for drink, our desire for exercise, our desire for activity, our desire for companionship, our desire for love, all of those things. So consider for a moment then that life itself gives us a desire or an appetite or an urge, if you want to call it, an inclination, right? To move in a certain direction, but the direction that we move in is for our good, Now, we may choose to move towards our good in a strange way, you know. So, for example, we may be thirsty and we may drink things that are not necessarily good for us, but that was a choice. That was a choice that we made. But the desire itself, the desire that we call thirst, causes us to engage in an activity of drinking that is good for us, may be good for us, in the purity of nature before we started figuring out all the different things we could do. Of course, there was water, and it's good for us. We need food, we need energy, and we have an appetite that causes us to eat. And Dr. Bales, in his book, Your Mind Can Heal You, he says, think about how marvelous the human body is. He says, if you injured yourself somehow and you lost a pint of blood, and you sat down and said to yourself, now I've lost a pint of blood, how am I going to replace that pint of blood? How much water do I need to drink? How much salt do I need to eat? What kind of foods do I need to ingest in order for this body to be able to replace that pint of blood? And he says, we don't have to worry about any of that, because nature takes care of it on its own. We crave certain foods. We crave salty foods. We thirst after water. Our body, our body has within it the wisdom of the perfect whole that leads it to know what to do if we will listen to it. If we will listen to it. So, at some point along this process of maturing and of growing, there arises within us this desire, this appetite to simply know God more fully. That's the best way that I can explain it. I just wish to know God more fully. And this, at that point then, our evolution becomes spiritual evolution. It is what Troward calls, we have entered the fifth kingdom. We have entered the spiritual kingdom. And now our evolution requires our conscious, deliberate cooperation of moving into a greater experience of the perfect whole. And as I mentioned last week, that requires us to let go of our staunch belief in materialism, our staunch belief that everything we have experienced in the senses is the absolute truth and the only truth. We have to start to recognize that there are things that are known that are not known to the intellect through a normal process. And this is what the mystics will talk about in terms of intuition. So the animals are guided by instinct, you see. When we need to replace a pint of blood, we are guided by instinct. But there is another way of knowing, and that way of knowing is an intuition, which is a direct knowing, a direct impartation of knowledge. And what Dr. Holmes tells us is that if we go back and if we look at the mystics of the ages, if we look at the great teachers of the ages, if we look at the great poets of the ages, if we look at the great scientists of the ages, these were people who were mystics. And he says a mystic is not a mysterious person, but is a person who has a deep inner sense of life and their connection to the unity, to the oneness. That's a mystic. And we have to recognize that we are all mystics. We may not be experiencing it to the same degree as some of the better known mystics, but the ability to have an experience of the deep inner sense of life and of the unity, that ability belongs to all of us, not just a select few, not just people who lived a long time ago in faraway places, in caves and things like that, but it is the destiny of each and every one of us, And as we start to move into that experience, we find that knowing, that a knowingness that didn't come to us through a regular process of logic and reason exists. Probably the best example that I can give to you there is like mathematics. If I asked you what 12 times 972 is, you could take a pencil and paper. You might even be able to do it in your head, but you would have a process by which you could work out that answer. 972 times 12. Well, let's see. 2 times 9. Well, that's 18, and carry and do. And we could manipulate the numbers. We could make it work. But in knowing, it's just there. It's just there through intuitive knowing. What's 12 times 972? Boom. The answer is there. And the reason for that is the perfect whole is already here. The perfect whole is already here. See, traditional thinking over the years, we have kind of adopted this view that, there may be this thing called the perfect whole, but we're somehow separated from it. We're apart from it. We're different than it is. And we may get back to it someday in the future, depending on how well we live our lives here on earth. Reward, punishment, those kind of things. Now the concept is we came from the perfect whole. We go back to the perfect whole. The question is when and how. And if you look at different religions, just ask yourself that question, when and how. When and how. The mystic says now. Now. Now is the time. We are the people now. And the way is letting go of everything unlike the perfect. You take the piece of marble and chip away everything that doesn't look like the angel when you have an angel. So what we want to recognize, what we want to consider then, is that from this point on, as we start to awaken, as we start to get that desire within us, that appetite within us that says, come home now. There's something so much better for you than you have ever experienced. There's perfect love. There's perfect health. There's perfect unity. We start to awaken to that. It is born in our consciousness like a child. We start to awaken to that. And then we must continue to feed it. We must continue to nurture it. We must continue to want that, In the East, we're told, do you want God as much as you would want a pond if your hair was on fire? Is your sincere desire, is it your number one thing in life, is to know God more fully? I love the music from Godspell, To love thee more dearly, to follow thee more nearly. Day by day, day by day. So what we are getting to is the perfect whole already is. And it is here and it is now. And we have come from the perfect whole and we are returning to the perfect whole, but it is not a physical journey. It is a spiritual journey. It is a journey in the awakening of our consciousness. In the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, the author has the protagonist, Thomas, asking Jesus, he says, where is this kingdom you keep talking about? Where is this kingdom? And the answer was, the kingdom is all about, it is here right now, but men do not see it. But men do not see it. So remember the teaching of Jesus, what Jesus spoke of, what he taught, was the kingdom, the experience of the presence of God. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all else will be added unto you. So he spoke of the kingdom, he spoke of this presence, he spoke of this experience, and he spoke of it so personally that he could say, I and the Father are one. It was real to him, it was tangible to him. So much so that people would say, he is God, he is God. But he also said, all of this that I have done you can do as well. So we have grown up into a culture that tells us that, yeah, we came from that, but we fell away from that, and we may someday get back to that perfect whole. And yet the mystic will say, it is here. It is now. It is not a physical journey that we are going on. It is not a place that we are going to that is on the other side of the galaxy. It is the only place that we have, which is in our consciousness. In our consciousness. So our journey then is one of expanding our consciousness. Our journey then is in our willingness to let go of stubborn ideas that tell us that the material is the only true reality. Our journey then is in spending time going within and being still and listening to the still, small voice within. We are individuals. We are individualized expressions of God. For each and every one of us, the path, the journey that we take in our consciousness will be slightly different. We read what great teachers have written down for us. We study, we listen, we do all of these things. But ultimately, we must have that experience ourselves. And Dr. Holmes tells us that once we get there, once we get to that point where our intuition is turned on, where our experience is real, it is nearer than our hands and feet, it is closer than our breath. At that point, he tells us the only one who can take us further is the divine itself. The divine itself. So it's as the Buddhist tells us, we build a raft to cross the river, but once we get across the river, once we have arrived, the raft is useless to us. There comes a time when we have to have that experience for ourselves. Whenever is right for us, whenever that little urge within us tells us it's time to leave this captivity, time to leave the entrapment of the senses, time to leave the belief of the race consciousness and head home, which is within our consciousness, which is to have the experience of the presence. Dr. Holmes, in his writings and his teachings, he did not talk very much about the mystical experience. He talked about it from time to time. He mentioned it. But one of his biographers, Bill Hornaday, said that Dr. Holmes didn't want people to think that he was weird, and the connotation mystic and weird, the two of them kind of seem to go together in our society. You use the word mystic and people think of Rasputin, the mad monk. And that's not it at all. It's Jacob Boehm, the cobbler, who could see the universe, the experience of the presence of God in the beauty of the geranium plant. But Dr. Holmes was giving a talk one time at the dedication of a church, I think it was in Glendale, California. And in the middle of his talk, he just said, "Yes, oh yes, I see it. The veil is very thin." And he went and he sat down, and the people who were there with him were concerned. They thought, he had been taken ill or something like that. And afterwards he told Dr. Hornaday that he had had a mystical experience in the middle of that talk. That suddenly, as he looked out at the audience, there were no longer human beings sitting there looking at him. But there were these little individualized lights. And I love it. Light. See? We are the lights. We are the lights. And we have to recognize that. And we have to be willing to experience that. And in order to do so, we have to be willing to let go of everything that we have ever learned that is wrong. So as we move forward in this Christmas season, I invite you this week, take some time, find a copy of the textbook, read the section on the perfect whole. But please recognize that when we are talking about the mystical experience, when we are talking about mystics, when we are talking about experiencing the presence of God, when we are talking about the burning fire that burns and does not consume. That we're not talking about other people. We're talking about you. This is your story. This is your growth. You have awakened to the fact that you are a spiritual being to develop that experience of God more fully every day. Let go of everything and anything in your life that impedes that experience. And so it is.